Mark sat quietly in his small room, the moonlight filtering through the narrow window. He had just returned from another long day of training, his muscles aching from the constant physical exertion. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, lost in thought. It had been weeks since he had arrived on this alien world, and every day felt the same, boring, routine, and uneventful. But tonight was different. There was something in the air, something he couldn't quite explain. He felt a strange unease in his gut, as if something was about to happen. As the minutes ticked by, the silence in the room deepened. Then, a soft knock on the door. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. Everyone in the camp had their own quarters, and the schedule was strict. It was rare for anyone to visit at night. Cautiously, he stood up and walked over to the door, his curiosity growing with each step. When he opened the door, no one was there. His eyes scanned the dimly lit hallway, but it was empty. Mark frowned, confused. He was certain he had heard the knock. Just as he was about to close the door, he noticed something on the floor, a small silver object that glinted in the light. Bending down, Mark picked it up. It was a strange, smooth metal disc with intricate symbols etched into its surface. He had never seen anything like it before. His mind raced, wondering who could have left it. Was it some sort of message, or perhaps a mistake? Before he could think any more about it, he heard a soft rustle behind him. Turning quickly, he saw her, an alien woman, standing just inside the doorway. She was tall and slender, her skin glowing faintly in the low light. Her eyes were bright and captivating, and her hair shimmered with an otherworldly sheen. She was beautiful, unlike any woman Mark had ever seen. She looked at him with a mysterious expression, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Without saying a word, she stepped closer, her presence filling the room with an undeniable energy. Mark stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? Why had she come to him? And why now? Then, with a soft voice, she spoke. "You are the one," she said. "The one I've been looking for." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. What did she mean? What was happening? And what was she doing in his room at this hour? Before he could respond, she added, "I need you to listen carefully. There is something important we must talk about." Mark swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change forever. Mark stood still, his mind racing as the mysterious alien woman stepped further into the room. She wasn't just any being from another world. There was an undeniable air of power and grace around her. Her presence felt almost magnetic, like she was drawing him in without even trying. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her. Everything about her was mesmerizing. Who are you?" Mark finally managed to ask, his voice shaky but curious. He had no idea how to process what was happening. An alien, here, in his room, speaking to him as though she had known him for years. The alien woman didn't answer immediately. She simply stared at him, her eyes glowing faintly, almost as if she was assessing him, studying him in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. Her gaze softened after a moment. "My name is Seraphis," she said in a voice that seemed both distant and intimate at once. "I am from a world far from here, a place you could never imagine." Mark's confusion deepened. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his throat dry as the words left his mouth. Was she here to study him? To make contact with Earth? Seraphis took a step closer, her presence growing even more intense. "I want you," she said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Mark couldn't breathe. What did she mean by that? "I know this is difficult for you to understand," Seraphis continued, her voice softer now. "But I didn't come here by accident. You've been chosen." Her words were calm, yet there was an intensity behind them, a certainty that sent a strange warmth through his chest. "Chosen?" Mark echoed, barely able to believe what he was hearing. "Chosen for what?" She paused, her eyes locking with his. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, as if the very walls were closing in. In my world, the bond between a human and an alien is rare, but it exists. And you are the one I've been searching for. Mark could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He wanted to ask more questions, but something inside him stopped him. There was an overwhelming pull to her presence, an urge to listen, to understand, even though everything in his mind screamed that this was impossible. "You're saying, you want me to be with you?" Mark asked, the words almost foreign on his tongue. He had no idea what kind of relationship this could even be, but it felt like the right question to ask. Seraphis nodded slowly. "Yes, I need you. We share a connection, something that binds us across worlds. You may not fully understand it yet, but I assure you, it is real." A silence settled between them, the only sound the soft hum of the air vent overhead. Mark's mind was reeling. He was still struggling to understand how any of this could be happening. But in his gut, he knew this wasn't just a dream, no matter how impossible it seemed. "I can't explain it, but I feel it," Seraphis said, her voice a whisper now. "I feel you, Mark, and I know you feel it too." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. How could he put into words this strange, powerful connection he felt growing inside him, a pull that was unlike anything he had ever experienced before? "I don't know what's happening, but—" Mark trailed off, his voice barely audible. "I feel it too. But why me? Why now?" Seraphis took another step closer, closing the distance between them. "Because you are the one I have been waiting for. You and I are destined to meet, and when we do, everything will change." Mark's pulse quickened. He couldn't deny the attraction he felt toward her, but he also couldn't ignore the fear bubbling inside him. His life had been simple, routine. Now, everything was uncertain. "I never expected this," Mark whispered. Seraphis smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Neither did I. But fate is a powerful force, Mark, and when it brings two souls together, there's no turning back." The tension in the room was palpable, and Mark could feel it growing with every second. He wanted to step away, to run, but something inside him stopped him. Something inside him wanted to stay, to know more. "I don't know what this means," he admitted, "but I'm not sure I can walk away from it." Seraphis reached out and gently placed her hand on his, the contact sending a shock through him. "You don't have to walk away. All you need to do is accept it." And just like that, Mark knew his life was about to change forever. The next day felt surreal to Mark. His mind kept replaying the events of the previous night, unable to fully comprehend the situation. He had met an alien, someone from a completely different world, and somehow she had claimed him as her mate. It was all too much. The logical part of his brain screamed that it couldn't be real, but everything about her, about the connection, felt so undeniable. Mark couldn't focus on anything. At work, he found himself distracted, staring off into space. He was constantly thinking about Seraphis, her mysterious presence, the way she seemed so sure of everything, and the way she made him feel. It was a mix of confusion, curiosity, and something else, a pull he couldn't explain. He hadn't told anyone about Seraphis yet. He couldn't. He was afraid they would think he was crazy, that they would dismiss him as someone who had lost their mind. But deep down, he knew what he felt. He knew she wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Later that evening, after another long and tiresome day, Mark returned to his apartment. The door clicked open, and to his surprise, there she was, Seraphis, waiting for him. She didn't look like an alien in the traditional sense. Her features were still humanoid, but there was something distinctly otherworldly about her, like she didn't quite belong. Her shimmering skin caught the light as she moved, and her long silver hair flowed like liquid under the glow of the moonlight. Mark could hardly breathe. "You came," he said, his voice shaky. Seraphis smiled warmly. "Of course I did," she said, her voice soft, yet confident. "I told you I would. The bond between us is stronger than you think, Mark." She stepped closer, and for the first time, Mark noticed the way she looked at him, intimately, as though she saw right through him. It made his heart race, and he took a step back, unsure of what to do or say. "Do you still think this is real?" Seraphis asked, her eyes searching his. Mark hesitated. He didn't know if he could still deny it, not after everything that had happened. I think I do," he admitted softly, his voice full of wonder. "But I don't understand it. I don't understand you." Seraphis reached out, brushing a strand of his hair away from his face, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him. "You will," she said, her voice tender. "With time, you will understand. Our connection will grow, and soon you'll realize we are more alike than you think. You're not just any human, Mark. You're special. I chose you for a reason." Mark's head spun at her words. She made it sound so simple, so effortless. And yet, everything about this felt like it was meant to be, like fate had led them here. "But I don't even know anything about your world, about you. How could this be real?" Mark questioned. Seraphis smiled again, her eyes sparkling as though she knew exactly what he was thinking. "In my world, love is different. It's not something we choose. It's something we feel. And I felt this pull toward you since the moment I saw you." Mark wanted to say more, to ask questions, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he simply stood there, captivated by her presence. There was no denying the connection, the electricity that crackled between them. He had never felt anything like it before. "I'm not ready for this," Mark said, stepping back, his thoughts racing. "I don't know how to do this. I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing." Seraphis' expression softened. "You don't have to be ready, Mark. The bond is already here. All you need to do is accept it." Mark's heart pounded. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but there was something inside him, a force, a feeling, that told him he didn't have much time. Everything he had known up until now had been normal, predictable. But this was different. This was something that was going to change everything. "Okay," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll accept it." A small smile crept across Seraphis's face, and she reached for him again. This time, when their hands touched, Mark didn't pull away. The shock of energy that flowed between them was undeniable. This wasn't just a strange encounter anymore. This was a bond, a connection that neither of them could escape. Seraphis leaned in closer, her lips almost touching his ear as she whispered, "This is just the beginning, Mark. And I promise you, it will be worth it." The room felt smaller, more intimate, as if the entire universe had narrowed down to just the two of them. Mark closed his eyes, letting himself fall into the moment. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And he had no idea just how much his world was about to change. The days following that night with Seraphis were a blur of emotions. Mark couldn't escape the feeling that his life had taken a turn into the unknown. Everything had changed so quickly. The world he knew, his quiet, ordinary existence, seemed so far away now. And every time he tried to make sense of it all, his thoughts kept circling back to Seraphis. He couldn't stop thinking about the bond they shared, the strange connection that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. It wasn't just a physical attraction. No, it was something deeper, something Mark couldn't explain. It was like their souls were intertwined, and every time he looked at her, he could feel her emotions, her thoughts, as if they were his own. It wasn't long before Mark realized that he was no longer living in his old world. Seraphis had brought him into hers, whether he was ready for it or not. She taught him about her people, the way her species viewed love and connection, and how different it was from anything he had ever known. In her world, relationships weren't just based on emotions. They were about deep, unbreakable bonds formed through shared experiences, and sometimes even destiny. One evening after a long day, Mark found himself standing in the kitchen of his apartment, deep in thought. He was trying to piece together the fragments of his life, but the more he thought, the more it became clear that the life he once knew no longer fit him. Everything about it felt out of place now. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts, and he opened it to find Seraphis standing there. Her glowing skin seemed to illuminate the dark hallway, casting a soft light around her. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Seraphis stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her presence filling the room in an almost otherworldly way. She didn't need to say anything for Mark to understand. She was here for him, and nothing was going to stop that. "You're thinking about it again," she said, her voice calm yet filled with an intensity that made his heart race, "wondering if this is real, if this bond is real." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know how to explain it. Everything about his life had been turned upside down. He'd spent years being rational, logical, thinking everything had a clear answer. But now, it felt like every rule he had known didn't apply. "I just don't understand, Seraphis," Mark admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "You say this bond is real, but how? How can I know it's not just some fantasy? How can I know that you're not just what?" She interrupted, taking a step closer to him. "Just another alien, another mystery for you to solve." Mark opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know what he feared. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't afraid of the bond. But what did it all mean? What was it leading to? Seraphis seemed to sense his inner turmoil. She reached out and touched his arm gently. "This bond is not something that can be explained easily, Mark," she said softly. "It's not about logic. It's not about answers. It's about something much greater. It's about destiny. And it's about us, together." Mark felt a wave of warmth spread through him at her words. It wasn't something he could explain, but the more he was around Seraphis, the more he understood. He felt it deep inside. A connection so strong, so unyielding, that it was impossible to deny. The room fell silent, the only sound the quiet hum of the apartment. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at Seraphis, her eyes filled with a certainty that made his doubts seem insignificant. "I'm not asking you to understand it all at once," she continued. "But you don't need to. All you need to do is trust in what we have. Trust that it's real." Mark stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. The confusion, the questions, the uncertainty, it all seemed so overwhelming. But at the same time, there was something inside him that told him not to be afraid. This was real. And somehow, he knew it was just the beginning. He nodded slowly, looking into her eyes. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll trust you. I'll trust us." Seraphis smiled, a soft, knowing smile that made Mark's heart flutter. Without another word, she stepped forward and closed the distance between them. She reached up, her fingers gently brushing his cheek, and Mark felt a jolt of energy course through his body at the touch. Her lips brushed against his, tentative at first, before deepening into a kiss that was as powerful as it was unexpected. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise, a seal on the bond they shared. And as their lips met, Mark knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. Seraphis pulled back slightly, her eyes locking with his. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. "Our journey together is only beginning, Mark." And in that moment, Mark realized that he had no idea where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to face it, whatever it was, because he wasn't alone anymore. Days passed, and Mark found himself completely immersed in his new reality. What had once been a simple life on Earth had now become a whirlwind of strange, yet beautiful experiences. Each day with Seraphis revealed new layers to their bond, and every moment felt like an adventure. He was learning more than he had ever imagined, not just about her world, but about himself. Seraphis was always there, a constant presence in his life. She had a way of understanding him that no one ever had. It was as if she could sense his every thought, his every hesitation, before he even voiced them. Yet it wasn't just the connection that made him feel drawn to her. It was the way she looked at him, her eyes filled with affection, trust, and a depth of emotion that he hadn't known existed. Mark had always considered himself independent, but now he felt like his world had shifted, and it had shifted because of her. But with this growing bond came something Mark had not anticipated: pressure. The pressure of making a choice. He hadn't been fully aware of it, but Seraphis had been waiting for him to decide. Waiting for him to make a commitment, not just to her, but to what their relationship could mean. One evening, they stood together on the balcony of Mark's apartment, overlooking the city. The night sky stretched endlessly before them, dotted with the lights of the city and the stars above. Mark was lost in thought, but Seraphis didn't need to say anything to know that he was struggling with something inside. "You're still unsure, aren't you?" Seraphis asked, her voice soft, yet filled with a quiet strength. Mark turned to her, his heart heavy. "I don't know what to think anymore," he admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I've never been in a situation like this before. And now, I have to choose. But how do I know what the right choice is?" She stepped closer to him, her presence calming. "It's not about what's right or wrong, Mark. It's about following your heart. It's about choosing what feels right for you." She placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "This bond, it's not something you can ignore. You feel it, just as I do." Mark looked down at her hand, the warmth of her touch spreading through him. "But what if I make the wrong choice? What if I choose the wrong path?" "There is no wrong path, Mark," Seraphis said, her voice firm now. "The only wrong choice is to deny the bond we share, to deny the connection that's been growing between us since the moment we met. This is your choice, but it's also mine. We're in this together." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He could feel it, the undeniable pull between them, a pull that was stronger than any doubt or fear he had. There was no going back. This was it. This was his future, and he was standing at the crossroads. "Seraphis," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "What does this mean for us? If I choose to follow this bond, to follow you, what happens?" Seraphis smiled, a small but knowing smile. "It means everything, Mark. It means that we will no longer be two separate beings. It means that you and I will be united in a way that transcends what you've known. It means we will face the challenges ahead, together." Mark closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply. He had never felt so conflicted in his life. His mind raced with questions, with uncertainties, but one thing was clear: he didn't want to live without her. The thought of it was unbearable. Slowly, he opened his eyes and looked at her. There was no more hesitation. He knew what he had to do. "I choose you, Seraphis," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "I choose us." Her eyes lit up, a mixture of relief and happiness dancing in them. She stepped forward and kissed him gently, the touch soft but filled with everything he had been feeling. It was as if the world around them disappeared, leaving only the two of them in that moment. "This is just the beginning, Mark," Seraphis murmured against his lips. "Our journey will be long, but it will be worth it. I will never let you go." Mark held her close, the weight of his decision settling over him. But this time, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like freedom. The freedom to choose his path, to choose his future, and to choose the woman standing before him. An alien beauty who had stolen his heart in ways he couldn't have imagined. And so, they stood there, in the quiet of the night, together. For the first time in his life, Mark knew that he had made the right choice. And with that choice, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, because he knew that, no matter what happened, they would face it together. The days that followed Mark's decision were a whirlwind of emotions, discoveries, and deeper connections. Though Mark had made his choice, he couldn't deny that the weight of the situation still lingered. A part of him was still adjusting to the magnitude of his decision. Marrying an alien princess wasn't something he had ever considered possible, or even conceivable. But now, it felt like his world had been turned upside down, and there was no going back. Seraphis, on the other hand, was serene. It was as if she had always known that Mark would choose her. She was patient with him, giving him time to process everything, even though she couldn't hide her excitement. She would often catch him looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, and each time, she felt her heart swell with love and pride. He was her mate now, and she would do everything in her power to show him that she could be the partner he needed. One evening, as they walked through the city together, Mark found himself marveling at how strange yet comfortable his life had become. The streets, bustling with people, both human and alien, seemed almost ordinary now. He'd gotten used to seeing Seraphis in this world, surrounded by humans, adjusting to Earth customs, and understanding the dynamics of Mark's world. Yet there were times when the sight of her, her alien features glowing under the city lights, still took his breath away. "Mark," Seraphis said, breaking the silence, "I want to show you something." He looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "What is it?" With a smile, she took his hand and led him down a narrow alley. At first, Mark was unsure of where they were going, but he trusted her. She had become his guide to this new world, the one where nothing seemed quite as it appeared. They stopped in front of an old, weathered building that Mark hadn't noticed before. There was something different about it, though. As Seraphis raised her hand and placed it gently on the wall, it began to glow. The stone seemed to shimmer, revealing hidden symbols Mark couldn't understand. It was like magic, yet there was nothing mystical about it. It was simply another aspect of her world that Mark didn't fully grasp. "This is where we come from," Seraphis explained, her voice soft, almost reverential. "This is where my people's history is kept, and where the bond we share was written long before we ever met." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Our bond," he echoed, his curiosity piqued. "Yes," she nodded. "It's written in the stars, Mark. Not just for you and me, but for all who choose to walk this path. Our connection, it's part of something bigger than us." Seraphis's words were heavy with meaning. She wasn't just talking about the bond between them. She was talking about their entire future, together, with all the possibilities and challenges that came with it. It was a future that stretched far beyond Earth, beyond the limitations of what Mark had known. And for the first time, he realized that he was ready for whatever came next. Suddenly, the wall in front of them shimmered and slid open, revealing a hidden chamber inside. The air was cool, and the room smelled faintly of ancient paper and ink. Mark stepped inside with Seraphis, the awe on his face evident. "This is where my ancestors kept the knowledge of our kind," she said as she walked toward the center of the room, where a large glowing orb rested on a pedestal. "It holds the truth of who we are and how we came to be. It holds the power to connect us all." Mark watched, intrigued as Seraphis's hand moved over the orb. It seemed to react to her touch, glowing brighter. She turned to him, her eyes filled with sincerity. "We are bound, Mark. Our destinies are now tied together. What happens next will be determined by the choices we make. But know this, you are never alone in this." Mark felt a surge of emotion rise within him, a deep, overwhelming feeling of love, connection, and belonging. This was it. This was the life he had chosen. And though he couldn't yet fully understand everything about Seraphis's world, he was no longer afraid. "I trust you, Seraphis," Mark said, his voice steady. "I trust us." Her smile was soft, yet filled with an intensity that made Mark's heart race. "And I trust you, Mark. Together, we will forge a future unlike any other." Mark looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing. He was ready to face them with her by his side, ready to learn, to grow, and to be a part of something far greater than he ever imagined. The bond between them was strong, stronger than any obstacle, any fear. And as they stood there, together in the chamber, Mark knew that no matter where this journey took them, they would always have each other. And that was enough. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Mark had accepted Seraphis into his life fully, but there were still challenges to face. They needed to plan for their future, for the life they were about to build together. With every new step, Mark felt a sense of awe mixed with uncertainty. But with Seraphis by his side, he couldn't help but feel stronger. Mark was introduced to more of her world. The technology that powered her species, the customs they followed, and even their deeply spiritual way of life. It was all so different from what he had known. But it wasn't just the newness of it that intrigued him. It was the promise that everything he learned brought him closer to understanding Seraphis. Her world was a part of her, and the more he understood, the closer their bond became. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of his apartment, Mark looked out over the city, which now felt like home. The lights twinkled like stars in the night sky. He felt her presence beside him, her warmth, the steady rhythm of her breath. "Mark." Seraphis spoke softly, her voice as smooth as the wind. "Do you ever wonder what our future holds?" He glanced at her, seeing the vulnerability in her gaze that she rarely showed. Seraphis, the proud princess, the one who had always known what was expected of her, was now facing a future she could not fully predict. Yet Mark could see her growing stronger every day, as she learned to navigate Earth and adapt to its ways, just as he was adapting to her world. "I think about it every day," Mark admitted, his voice low and thoughtful. "But no matter what comes, I know I'm not walking through this alone. We have each other." Seraphis smiled, the light in her eyes reflecting both the stars above and the future they would create. "You're right," she said. "We will face whatever challenges come, and we will do it together." But not all was peaceful. Mark was still adjusting to the fact that Seraphis's past held weighty responsibilities that would eventually affect their future. She was the princess of a race unlike anything Mark had ever encountered. Her people had been scattered across the stars for millennia, always in conflict with other alien races. There were still old grudges to resolve, factions within her society that didn't always agree on the path forward. As much as Seraphis tried to shield Mark from the dangers of her political world, he knew it was only a matter of time before their choices would have consequences. The connection they shared made them a target, and both Mark and Seraphis would have to face the challenges of uniting not only their worlds, but also the hearts and minds of those who may not want peace. "Whatever happens," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with resolve, "we face it together. I'm ready for what comes next." Seraphis' expression softened, her heart full of love and gratitude for the man who had not only accepted her but had made her believe in the possibility of a future where both their worlds could coexist. And then they both turned their gaze toward the stars. The path ahead was uncertain, the future a vast expanse of unknowns. But Mark knew one thing for certain. His heart was now forever intertwined with hers. "We have only just begun," Seraphis whispered, her hand in his. As the stars shone down upon them, they both knew that, together, they would navigate whatever came next. Their bond was unbreakable. Their love was a force that could not be shaken, not by time, not by distance, and certainly not by the challenges that awaited them. The adventure of their lives had just begun, and they were ready to embrace whatever it might hold. Together, as one.